Hello and welcome to the Brooklyn Rail's 868th New Social Environment. I'm Eleanor, a Programs Associate here at the Rail, and today I have the huge pleasure and privilege of being your MC for a conversation with Julia Bryan-Wilson, Bridget R, and Trevor Paglen. We're also thrilled to welcome poet Hannah Treasure here to close today's program. Before we get started, the Brooklyn Rail acknowledges Black Lives Matter, and here in New York, we are on Lenapehoking, the unceded land and waters of the Wappinger, Canarsie, Munsee, and Lenni Lenape people of the Delaware Nation and Shinnecock Indian Nation. We recognize land acknowledgements are not a replacement for necessary decolonial work, but serve as a reminder of place, of the legacies of dispossession and enslavement that sustain and enrich the stolen land we are speaking from. And now to introduce today's guest and host. Julia Bryan-Wilson is the author of Louise Nevelson's sculpture, Drag, Color, Join, Face. Her previous books include Art Workers, Radical Practice in the Vietnam War Era, and Fray, Art and Textile Politics, which won the ASAP Book Prize and the Frank Jewett Mather Award from CAA and the Robert Motherwell Book Award. She also teaches at Columbia University and is a Curator-at-Large for MASP in Sao Paulo. Bridget R. is a scholar and curator focused on the art of African Americans. She serves as Chancellor's Fellow and Professor of African American Studies and Art History at the University of California, Irvine. Her books and articles and essays can be found widely across interdisciplinary academic publications and art exhibition catalogs. And she is most well known as the author of the book Exhibiting Blackness, African Americans and the American Art Museum. And Trevor Paglen is an artist whose work spans image making, sculpture, investigative journalism, writing, engineering, and other disciplines. Paglen has launched an artwork into distant orbit around Earth in collaboration with Creative Time and MIT, contributed research and cinematography to the Academy Award-winning film Citizen 4, and created a radioactive sculpture for the exclusion zone in Fukushima, Japan. Paglen has had solo exhibitions at numerous international venues and is the author of several books and articles. It is such a huge honor to have you all here in conversation today, and I'm going to now pass it over to Julia to get started.
Thank you so much, Eleanor. Thank you to everyone at the Brooklyn Rail. Thank you especially to Trevor and Bridget for being in conversation with me. And thank you to all who have joined us today on this Thursday. Happy August. And also, of course, thank you to Hannah, who will be closing us out with a poetry reading. So I'm going to just begin by spending a few minutes talking about the book and showing you the special format, because I'm calling this a modular monograph. Here is the book. It's in 4 volumes in a black slipcase, and they can be read in any order. Each volume is dedicated to a single keyword. That's also what I talk about as a kind of procedure of Nevelson's sculptural making. So drag, color, join, and face. And one of the things that I really was interested in doing was making something that was really light and portable. So often in the contemporary art world, when things come in like a big box set, they're often these super expensive, massive catalog raisonné that cost like, I just looked at the David Smith catalog raisonné that's like a 3-volume, really, really heavy $500 set. And to me, that's really aimed at institutions and libraries and museums rather than at readers. So for me, I really wanted to keep these very portable, thin, so you can put it in your backpack and read it on the train. And that was part of the idea behind this admittedly kind of risky format of splintering a book, a monograph, into 4 separate units. So maybe I'll just very quickly share my screen also and talk a little bit more about the content here. Let me know if you can see this or if I need to how does that look? Is that correct? Okay, great. So I wanted to focus primarily on sculpture, that is in the title of the book, and to really pay attention to the consistency of Nevelson's primary sculptural procedures. And I'm showing you just kind of a paradigmatic work of hers. It's called Black Wall from 1959. These are grid-based found object sculptures, mostly comprised of wood, often painted black, but sometimes also painted white or gold. And this is one that I saw that is on display at Tate Modern. So again, this is an image of the special format of this modular monograph. Maybe we can talk more about that in the Q&A, because it raises a lot of questions about kind of my own authority, and also a kind of relinquishing of my of some aspects of my argumentation, really giving it over my agency, putting that in the hands of the reader. So as I said, Nevelson kind of found an idiom, or as I was gesturing to, there was a kind of overarching sculptural idiom that Nevelson kept returning to for several decades. And I wanted to really honor that consistency and pay attention to the seriality and the modularity of her own work. So here you can see these pieces are separated by, decades, 1958 on the left and 1982 on the right. They're both titled Sky Cathedral. We can talk more also about titles. And she's returning again and again to wood painted black in a kind of grid-based format using scavenged wood pieces. So the 4 different volumes, which are titled Drag, Color, Join, and Face, have a lot of different meanings that emerge. But in drag, I'm primarily thinking about what it means to drag like a river. So when you drag a river, you're trawling. Nevelson scraping the streets of New York for her objects that she was interested in. And this is a spread from the book where I talk about some of her collages. So on the right is a collage where she's using a piece of textiles as well as bits of wood. And I put that next to the incredible quilter Rosalie Tompkins, who also is a scavenger, a reuser, someone who's using the scraps of the world to kind of create a new aesthetic. And another thing that is kind of important about the book is what I call a sort of politics of comparison. So putting Nevelson into a constellation of artists that are mostly artists of color, feminist artists, queer artists, and artists from the global South as a way of kind of expanding our sense of what art histories we can kind of conjure into relation. In color, I think not only about the kind of valences of white and gold and black, I also think about the racialization of those colors. And also I think about, I try to talk about Nevelson's work and its relationship to photography. So here's an example. This image on the left isn't actually in the book, but it demonstrates something that I talk about, which is that it's very hard to take photographs, really good photographs of Nevelson's all black sculptures. And this one is really overlit. You can see that the flash has turned areas of this all black sculpture very light gray, or they even kind of register as white. And it's part of the kind of racialized technology that has like kind of haunted photography from its outset, how it was calibrated for white skin rather than for dark tones. So there's this kind of overcompensation, and also the kind of reflectance of Nevelson's paint means that it kind of confounds the technology of photography. And again, here's a person, I'm putting Nevelson in conversation with someone of a later generation who I feel like is obviously very inspired by Nevelson, which is the African-American artist Leonardo Drew. And this is a piece where, again, this is an all black wood piece, but you can see how some of these shards or twigs and pieces of lumber kind of register as white or very light gray due to the flash of the photograph. The next volume, which is called Join, it thinks about Nevelson's acts of conjoining, that is kind of literally piecing things together. So I'm theorizing with the notion of assemblage here, and you can see a detail of some of the nails poking out. This is a piece that's at MoMA called Big Black. And I'm also in this volume thinking about how titles kind of join meanings together. So I've given an example of one of Nevelson's, quite vast titles here, which is Totality 2, and that's at the Fog, which is in Cambridge, Massachusetts. And lastly, Face is a volume that not only thinks about Nevelson's own face, which was a really powerful visage, very photographed, famous face of this older woman. She was incredibly elegant, commanding, amazing, it had an amazing look, and how her face has circulated in the world. But also I propose that a lot of her sculpture has a kind of faciality or a frontedness. And so I'm showing you one of her public sculptures. She had a very large and prolific career as a public sculptor. This one is in Cambridge, called Nightwall, that has this kind of frontality. So it proposes a kind of public face of itself. And I'm trying to put these things in dialogue to also ask questions about what it means to face her work and to face wood in a time of climate catastrophe. So I'm going to X out of this. I know that was kind of like a whirlwind tour perhaps, but it just offers some glimpses of some of the theoretical questions that I was trying to get at. This is not a catalog raisonné of Louise Nevelson. It is not like the definitive account. There can be no such thing as a definitive account. There's already been a very beautiful, robust biography by Louise Wilson of Nevelson's life. So what I'm doing is something different. It's an art historical speculation. It's a series of related arguments from my own perspective. So that's what I'm hoping to offer to the reader. So with that, maybe we can turn things over to Trevor and Bridget, who have some points they want to make or questions for me.
Beautiful. Thank you so much, Julia. And it's just amazing to be in conversation with you today as a longtime friend and interlocutor. I wanted to start really basically. So you have a massive range. It gets a little bit, it's too constraining, I think, to even call you an art historian, although you obviously are one of the most prolific and well-celebrated art historians of our moment. But you're a critic, a cultural analyst, a teacher, a mentor, a public intellectual, and you're also a curator. And you recently did this big exhibition about Nevelson that was in Venice, and I believe that there was pieces of that were going to other places as well. You've written about art and activism. You've written about telekinesis, modernism, minimalism, nuclear waste sites, textiles, crafts, material histories of different subcultures. So my first question is, why Nevelson? How'd you end up here?
Yeah, great. I mean, it's an obvious starting point and something I've tried to trace myself many times. And I don't have like a really consolidated, crisp answer for that. I think there's many histories that brought me to this subject. I think for one thing, Nevelson has a kind of double afterlife, which is that she is in a way very ubiquitous. She is not someone who's been totally neglected, absolutely, swept under the rug of history. Her work was widely collected. She's in a lot of museums. There was a postage stamp dedicated to her, that the US Postal Service issued. This was a very big cultural figure, and in some ways, someone who's kind of ubiquitous. On the other hand, there has been really a lack of critical attention, and especially I think of sort of scholarly art historical interest in what exactly her sculptures are doing or how they have come to mean. So I think I was actually interested in that kind of conundrum, what it means to tell a story that on the one hand is somewhat familiar and yet has been kind of neglected. And coming from a feminist perspective, the example of Nevelson is also so interesting because on the surface, the forms don't seem sort of overtly gendered. And I think she was, in some ways, she was a kind of vexed person for the feminist movement in the 70s, because they're not like Louise Bourgeois, who's dealing with kind of like embodied figuration in some examples. So and at the same time, Nevelson herself had a lot of theories about gendered making and about how she was using wood as a woman would, So I think to me, there were just so many fascinating, interesting, questions to ask. And I definitely did not set out in this book to kind of answer or find the key, to like unlock these interpretations. For me, it was just like, wow, what do we do with this? Like, put this face next to, these scraps of wood that on the page can look really sleek, but in person can be very shambolic. And, I'm always really interested in materiality and in process. So I don't, like I said, I wish I had the kind of elevator pitch of like, lightning bolt hit me that Nevelson was it for me, but it was more like a slow build of like, this person really deserves careful, close study. And actually the sculptures are so open-ended that that a lot of meaning can be opened up, in front of them. So maybe I hope that helps begin, but maybe, yeah. Was that helpful? I don't know.
No, it's super helpful. And it's interesting that you use that metaphor of opening up or this kind of expansion, because as I was reading the book, it felt like each of these modules was almost like a firework that was spreading out, and there was different pieces of things with different luminosities that were going in different directions. And there's just a huge constellation of things that you are using Nevelson to talk about, to kind of go back and forth and in and out. And that's something I want to talk about more, but I think the obvious place to start with that idea is this form of the book itself, which is unorthodox in this like very delightful way. You have these 4 individual sections, which as a reader, I thought was really fun and really accessible, actually, which is much more than, as you mentioned before, approaching, a thick tome. And so it feels almost like a box set of records or something like that. You have these themes: drag, color, join, face. Is there something about Nevelson in particular that prompted this as a form for the book?
Yes. And I want to answer that, but I actually want to first ask Bridget, as a fellow art historian, who's in the room with us today, if Bridget, what was your, before you read this book, perhaps, or before we've talked about Nevelson and my working on this, did you have kind of like a take on her, Nevelson? Like, because she was never included in any of the classes I took of 20th century surveys. Like I said, she was very famous, in some regards, a kind of like semi-canonical figure, yet sort of curiously also absent in some ways. So Bridget, I'm just curious what your take was there.
I would say, and thank you for all of this that has happened before I'm speaking. I'm really delighted to be here. I was just thinking that learning about Nevelson's work was never a focus of any particular class. And the only time that I remember seeing her work was alongside herself. Like the photographs would show her, and then it would show some giant sculpture. And I think the immediate point, maybe of the photographer, if not the professor, was, look at this older woman standing next to this big sculpture, and she made it. Isn't that crazy? And it didn't really go beyond that. So she was presented as kind of an oddity instead of a serious artist who had work that we really needed to talk about in class. It was kind of this aside. It was also, I think, in relationship to architecture and some of the photographs that I saw, so that you'd see her work featured around all these other buildings, and then these younger men who were actually doing the labor, which was installation. And the labor was not about actually making the work itself. So there are ways that my experience as an art history student sort of rhymes with what you're saying, and that she sort of elided other more conventional ways in which we learned about and took seriously the art by male sculptors.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you for that, Bridget. That's such a helpful reflection. So to get back to, or to marry that comment about kind of architectural building, perhaps with Trevor's question about the form, And the subject, absolutely. I mean, I felt like, I mean, I had many thoughts about how I would put this book together, many thoughts. And for a long time, I just thought I'm just writing a monograph. It'll have an introduction, and then it'll be, maybe I'll think about, you know, the prints and also the drawings, and then also the environments. And then, you know, maybe it would be something like that, where I would think about different genres or different materialities, and then it would have a conclusion, and it would, like, you know, fit on any bookshelf next to, you know, any a book about whatever, David Smith, just to go back to him. But increasingly, as I was writing, I got so interested in how Nevelson herself made these sculptures. So first, this act of gleaning, the scavenging, the dragging, the finding. Then she often would directly paint the scraps. So like, instead of, she had this huge storehouse of materials, and she would sometimes immediately dunk like a broken chair leg into a bucket of black paint and then store it. Then she would join things together. And then lastly, she circulated those sculptures out into the world. And I realized that those 4 words, which are nouns, you know, and they're also verbs, were so potent and so interesting as a way of kind of breaking apart her different process, that they could also be these entry points for me. And the idea of 4 volumes was like, you know, quadrilateral. It's about the quadrilateral, you know, rectangle, the 4 sides of a square, which she repeatedly came back to again and again as someone fascinated with the grid. And the idea of splintering the authority of the monograph. So, I mean, there was all different, to me, there's so many different ways that this format makes sense specifically for this artist. And to me, the idea that you can read one and have a different take, depending on what order you read them in, you're going to have kind of like a slightly different perspective. And, you know, one of the things that I feel really defiant about with Nevelson's work is that one of the criticisms that was leveled against her was that they all look the same, which they of course don't. There are so many ways that they look, but the idea that the seriality and the iterability of her work can be kind of monotonous. I really wanted to challenge that and think actually about how modularity works as a kind of vocabulary. So if you shift just one letter of the alphabet, you have a different word, you know, and I feel like that's what she was also doing, is shifting, by shifting just little things, sometimes really different resonances can emerge. And I was hoping to kind of echo that with my, with the format. No, go ahead, Bridget.
Sorry, I had one more thing that I wanted to say, in thinking about format. You know, it's an invitation to phenomenology. I mean, I'm also thinking of always about my students and how it's an invitation to really have a physical presence with the work, but it's also it brings, and I'm using Trevor's word, something delightful to even touching the book, and that kind of you know, real touching, right? Not the screen, but something that you hold in your hand and engage with, I think is something that I lament that my students are not having that kind of experience, where now it's like, no, go ahead and reach into this box, right? And you'll see the box in Nevelson's work, and hold it in your hand, and you put it back and you pick the next one. So there's a way in which the process of learning and research, I think, mirrors, I'll use that word, mirrors the content of the work. And this may sound obvious, but I just wanted to have this be said. And I wanted to go a little bit further, just to talk about the language that you use. And Trevor, you may be getting to this, so I won't go on and on, but there's an accessibility in your language, you know, and you're just very clear, like, I'm not saying this, I am saying this. Great. You know, it's so clear and so accessible in a way that I think provides, and there's multiple ways and multiple times I'm going to say this, provides a new model for doing art history, where it doesn't have to be opaque. It doesn't have to be authoritative in this way that's the voice of God, right? It's like, no, this is me. This is what I'm saying. I have credentials. I have looked at this for quite a long time. And, you know, the fact that there are all these different books, right? As you're saying, offers different perspectives, different ways of opening up. And you're very clear about that in your language. So, you know, it is rigorous and it is smart. And I know we're going to talk more about that. But the accessibility is really important. I think I feel like I absolutely hear your voice in this work, and that's so important for, I think, doing new kinds of methodologies for art history or querying art history, which I think is really relevant to the whole project.
Well, thank you for that, Bridget. It means so much. And it's true that, I mean, when I first got this in the mail from the press, like an advanced copy, you know, and I had fought so hard to have them do this, because it is really unconventional. And I was in a hot panic when I got it and the volumes kind of came out. And I realized like, oh, this is really, you know, somebody just might read this. This is just a fourth of what I'm trying to do. Like, and of course, in a regular book, people just read one chapter, but it kind of like concretized that in a way. And one of the ways I talked myself down from my actual, you know, from feeling totally terrified that I had made a really big mistake by having it be in this format was like, well, maybe there will be like 4 students who are housemates and they can only afford one copy, but that means they can each read it at the same time. I don't know. I had some thought about precisely this kind of idea of accessibility. And it's true. Thank you again, Bridget. It's such a huge compliment. This idea of kind of the accessibility. To me, that's not, you know, we need to prize clarity more in some academic disciplines. And I am hopeful that people do get something out of this, you know, that it is readable, that though it, you know, it's dealing with difficult issues about ethics and, you know, all kinds of things, that there is also something that is, that feels exciting to interface with in a tactile way.
I'd love to pick up on something that you said a little bit in passing, Bridget, about being introduced to Nevelson and your experience of Nevelson being like, oh, here's a picture of this kind of fantastical looking older woman next to this sculpture, and there's an image there, right? And there is a viscerality to her presence. She really is almost her own archetype in a way. And I want to put that in relation to some of the things you talked about in the first part of the book, the drag part, where you say very clearly you're taking a queer approach to the book. And obviously there's this obvious formal queering of the idea of the monograph itself. And you're challenging a lot of orthodoxies over the course of the monograph. And I want to talk about some of that later, but we can start with this character of Nevelson. She's obviously somebody who's lived a very unconventional life, particularly for a woman of her era. And at the beginning of this drag module, for lack of a, you know, the sub book, you invoke queerness alongside Federici's figure of the witch. And this is a motif that you sort of develop against, you know, in relation to Nevelson. So I want to know a little bit about what you mean by queerness in the context of the book, and how the figure of the witch speaks to you, you know, and to Nevelson.
Sure, great. Those are great questions. Yeah, I mean, I am queer. I'm a queer feminist, and those are my commitments and my methodologies. And I do use the word queer in a historical sense, in terms of like how it would have been used, you know, in the 40s and 50s to mean kind of eccentric or unconventional. Nevelson did not identify as queer. I am not saying that she did, nor do I say that she had sex with women. That's not the claims I'm making at all. So let me just, that's something I do say numerous times, but she did live an unconventional life. And in that respect, there is a queerness to her domesticity. And again, I am not meaning that in the kind of this very specific sense of kind of same-sex desire, but I am meaning that in that she was married and had a child, and then she did reject heterosexual marriage as a kind of paradigm and lived in a more kind of bohemian way. And for me, the idea of queering art history, it's much more capacious than just a biographical set of desires. Obviously, it is about a way of smashing open questions of what the family is and also what form is. Are we understanding form as a kind of successive chronology of different canonical movements, or are we understanding that some artists are kind of sly about their approach to something like abstract expressionism, or are they undermining the tropes of Cubism, or are they, coming with a gendered kind of valence towards, what some even call Dada in the case of Nevelson. So is she kind of inhabiting these movements in this much more, in this non-normative way? And that's how I'm thinking of it very much. I also do, I also am quoting, I bring in some queer feminist artists who looked to Nevelson very specifically as a kind of foremother, so a piece by Deborah Cass, for example, that's the spiraling neon piece called After Louise, Nevelson actually names her, that says, anger, I'd be dead without my anger. So something about kind of feminist rage also. So that's what I mean when I talk about the queerness. And in terms of the witch, yeah, I mean, Nevelson, the literature, the critical literature on Nevelson, it's just absolutely filled with sorceresses and conjurers, etc. And she was really, I think, played with that. It was it was in part a self-produced image because she was older when she got recognition. She was, in her late 50s, early 60s when she really started having international acclaim. And she was at that point, she was no longer married. She had this really incredible presence. And I think that to position herself as a kind of disobedient woman on the fringes, I mean, that's what a witch really is a disobedient woman who like owns her powers, I think was really strategic for her. And so I'm interested in, kind of tracing how that positioning of herself as a witch does chime with someone like Federici, who's a feminist theorist of the witch, and also the witch as a figure that emerges in times of transition in terms of labor. And the witch, so the witch, in other words, is also a labor category. It's a category that flies in the face of capital and the organization of labor and women's work, and how the witch kind of circumvents that with her conjurations. So to me, that was all really potent and interesting to think with.
The other kind of theme in the section on drag is literally like the dragging and the scavenging of the refuse of the city and of, just built environments and putting them together. And why did that become such an important kind of thread in your reading of Nevelson?
Right, the question of scavenging and the foundation. I mean, mostly because that so much of her early sculpture, that is the foundation. And also I wanted to kind of have a conversation with Bridget as someone who's based in Southern California and, someone who thinks with the Black arts movement so much. To me, the question of scavenging and the found object, it has been, we do now understand what a principal move that is of so much African-American cultural production. And more and more museums are kind of installing Nevelson alongside objects from the Black arts movement. So really great installation that Mocha LA had a few years ago with a Nevelson next to a Betty Saar. I mean, I think for me, the scavenging is just such a principal move of so many kind of minoritarian acts of making. And it's just, it comes from a scrappy sense of survival, and resourcefulness. So I talk about Agnes Varda, the French filmmaker, and her idea of gleaning. I include a picture of Cecilia Vicuña that I took of Vicuña literally hauling trash out of the Mississippi River in order to make sculptures from it. And really importantly, I kind of arrived at Nevelson as a topic through an encounter that I had with Noah Purifoy. living in Southern California. And so Bridget, I was hoping we could kind of talk more about that because, Purifoy, so important, so major, so, historically somewhat also neglected until that kind of had this explosive moment. And now, of course, like so understood as so very central. And I think that living in Southern California and visiting his Joshua Tree installation and realizing like, this is a whole world, this is a whole way of approaching the world. And so realizing that Nevelson is really in conversation and in dialogue with that approach.
Yeah, I think I was really happy to read what you wrote when you were talking about these issues and of scavenging, and also the idea of dwelling sort of among these refuge or refuse, what's been cast aside. We think about Kelly Jones's work in particular when she's writing about Black Los Angeles in her book South of Pico, and that all of the trash dumps in Los Angeles were located in Black and Brown communities, notably Watts, so that even when you're looking at work by Keenholz, we think of Keenholz going to Watts to get trash, if not Black trash, to make work. And I absolutely think about Noah Purifoy and a way of scavenging things away and then building, putting things together again, querying things that are not conventionally thought to be side by side or be joined or connected in any way. I also think about Blackness as charred remains, right? And thinking about Noah Purifoy's 66 Nines of Neon and collecting the charred neon signs after the Watts riots. And, there's the phoenix from the flame, and, rising up from this burning and creating new worlds, new modules, new articulations. I like very much the way that you sit Blackness socially and racially alongside the Blackness that is so undeniable in your face. And, as you showed with your presentation, decade after decade after decade, these are all Black. You can't just say, well, she had a Black period like a lot of white artists and musicians do. It's like, no, she was saying something. She was dwelling in the Blackness. And I like the way that you can sort of spin, and I think about a movement of Blackness and seeing all the different ways that we can visualize it and understand it and integrate it into even metaphor, aside sociality and race and lived experiences of Blackness. I love the way that you do that in the book. And it's not, again, with the accessibility, it's not, for some people, it's like, well, this is a little far-fetched, like that lowercase b and the big B, like clearly, it's laid out in such a way, it's just like, yeah, it's there. And maybe it will allow some people to kind of relax into it and actually see what it might be instead of being so afraid of it. And so I think it's really well done, and I'm definitely going to be using that. When we're talking about the form and modularity, and you were talking about the 4 housemates, I'm thinking also about group work. Okay, you guys get dragged, you guys get joined, we're meeting on Friday, and tell us what you learned. I mean, and having that conversation between students who have sort of dropped anchor into the books is going to be really magical, I think.
Bridget, I love what you just said about the dwelling in the Blackness. That really strikes me as apt and a beautiful way to put it. The first article I published about Nevelson ended with a kind of speculative kinship between Purifoy and Nevelson, and I really do see them as in relation. And then doing further research, I found a piece by Purifoy called for Louise Nevelson, which is now in the book, a really beautiful homage that shows that, in fact, there was some, at least on his side, interest in what she was doing, and that she was a touchstone for him. And I think that so moving for me to think about, these artists separated by gender, by race, by coast, but having a kind of dialogue across time and space in vis-a-vis the found object. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely.
When we come back to that, the kind of brute fact of the blackness of the sculptures and of the work, and I know there's exceptions to that. There's white ones and there gold ones, but the vast majority of them are black, is my understanding. There's a quote that I think was attributed to Nevelson, was talking about being an architect of shadows, and there's a huge amount of dimensionality to it, not only in terms of like shades of black, but the way that light is interacting with these objects that are very three-dimensional, right? And are very, they're kaleidoscopic in a way in terms of how they're lit and how you navigate around them. And that you touched very briefly on in your introduction about the fact that these sculptures are not really photographable, right? And there's a part of that just because photographing a sculpture, a photograph of a sculpture is not a sculpture, but there's a technological history here, there's a racial history here, there's a lot of stuff going on in that interplay between the sculpture and the image of the sculpture as it's made for a publication. And that's something you spend a lot of time on. Do you want to talk us through what that labyrinth is like a little bit?
Well, I'm curious about your insights, Trevor, as a photographer, about how, I guess, yeah, I would love to hear what you have to say about the complexities of photographing an all Black monochrome that furthermore has depth and dimension. So these are reliefs, primarily when we're talking about like most of the gridded wall-based sculptures are reliefs that do have like niches, indentate, things, box, they're kind of little assemblages within the bigger assemblages. Technically, could you make sense of my argument there about the kind of drive to make things gray?
Oh, absolutely. It makes perfect sense. Photography equipment, particularly historically, is essentially calibrated for a white face, right? So it's very racialized in terms of how the technology is made and what assumptions are built into what constitutes a good image, as well as assumptions about what it is that you're going to be photographing, right? And so I think in the, work that was being made in the 50s, 60s, 70s and being photographed, film literally could not capture those tones, right? And so you would have to, overcompensate for that by lighting it very strongly or doing a much longer exposure. But then when you do that, you're going to end up with an image that veers towards more of a, a higher gray or even more towards the white spectrum. So so the actual colors of her work are simply not reproducible in photographic and printed media from that time, right?
Yeah. I think I had a kind of, I felt that I had a responsibility in some ways to reproduce images in the book that I mostly had taken, where I had mostly, as much as I could, I had personally stood in front of these sculptures and apprehended them with my own eyes and my own body and tried to take the pictures myself with my own, crappy cell phone camera, because I was interested in how, this contemporary reproductive technology would translate these sculptures. And I also did a lot of work looking back at kind of catalogs and journalistic accounts and saw, wow, the images are all over the map. I am looking at the same photo, sculpture, wood painted black. And in this image, it is just totally inks and, a darkness. And in this one, it literally is so gray, it almost looks white. And this is a really, and I am sure that Nevelson knew this, she's looking at her own work being photographed. And I think there's something kind of radical and stubborn about like, yeah, I am continuing to make work that is really, really hard to reproduce, you know, and I'm asking you to stand in front of it, to see it with your own eyes. So to me, the question of photography and the limits of the technology were became such a crucial point. And I put it, again, this is quite speculative, but I try to put that in conversation, the kind of unphotographability of the face of the sculpture. I kind of put that in or throw that into relief, or I have a kind of argument about attention with Nevelson's own face, you know, and how photographed she was, and maybe thinking about like, well, maybe there's a kind of interesting complex reaction formation happening. I mean, I'm not trying to psychoanalyze her at all, but just thinking like, well, it's interesting to think about how the sculptures do not lend themselves to photography, and yet her own face really was incredibly photogenic. You know, she had such strong features, so incredible, like in terms of the fashion and the features, you know, which are so striking. So what do we do? How can we put those things together? And maybe we can't make sense of that. And maybe, you know, but it's interesting to think about how, you know, even the stamp of her, you know, is her body, not, you know, as opposed to like just a black, you know, box, which would have been a very different choice. I
There's
don't know.
one point that
Oh, sorry, go ahead.
Oh, there's one point that I think it's really important that we get to, which is, again, I'm not an art historian, I'm not a specialist in this, but there's a part in your book where I was reading it and my brain kind of switched a little bit, and it's like, oh, I see what there's this other thing that you're doing, and I realized you're sort of continuing a project that's sort of been a meta project of yours across, you know, all of your work, which has to do, in my opinion, or in my reading of it, at least, has to have to do with challenging the field of art history itself. In the sense that when one writes about artists and artworks, part of the process is to write about those in relation to other artists and other artworks. And you're really exploding this much further than I think most of the books that I've read in art history typically do, in terms of creating a much broader constellation that Nevelson fits into, both temporally as well as culturally. So you're putting into Nevelson into tension with artists generations before her, generations after her, and from a much wider cultural range that you would normally find in a discussion of a kind of contemporary New York artist from this moment. So there's a lot of artists that I had not heard of, whose work I would have never known about. So why don't you talk a little bit about this very rich and very broad constellation of artists that you're putting Nevelson into tension?
Thank you. Yes. It's true that I think part of the job, one of the jobs of the art historian, is to make a network, you know, or to think about lineage or vectors of influence, or, you know, create a kind of chorus. Like, Bridget, wouldn't you agree? Like, we don't want to isolate, you know, you don't want to, or I don't anyway, I don't want to like make someone an exemplar who's kind of isolated in the world.
Yeah, I absolutely agree with that. And, you know, part of that is, I think, a political project in terms of bringing underrepresented. And I know it was helpful to hear you talk about Nevelson. It's like she is underrepresented and not at the same time. But addressing the not at the same time, part of the political project I think that I have, and clearly you have, as art historians, is to help people figure out how to look at artwork, how they might think about it, how they might bring it into the classroom, or their own studies about another artist working before, after, or at the same time that they just never considered. You know, so yes, not isolating her or elevating her as being better than anyone else. You know, that's not really helping. You know, we can all appreciate her in different ways, and it's best to get rid of the hagiography. That's such a big part of art history and the canon, and the way that all of us probably on the call have learned about art history. It's through these great, mostly male artists. It's like, we're not trying to necessarily, at least not all the time, counter that with great women artists. It's like, here's a whole different queered approach to thinking about art history, which is in conversation
Yes.
and getting rid of the sort of master narrative.
Right. So for example, I mention people like Kurt Schwitters, who Nevelson was often compared to, Picasso, who was a major touchstone for her, Kazimir Malevich, who was a big, has also been mentioned in comparison to Nevelson. Those people are there, they're in the book, but I don't focus on interpretations that put her in that lineage. Instead, for example, when I'm talking about the question of the monochrome, I have created this word called the material monochrome that comes from material culture. And so I put Nevelson's work next to, for example, Ukrainian whitework. So textile embroidery, she would have been very familiar with whitework. And there's an enormous, fascinating literature and robust heritage around Ukrainian whitework embroidery. And then also the black on black ceramics of the indigenous potter Maria Martinez. So those are the two pictures that I illustrate to think about histories of the monochrome instead of, a Malevich. And not just, all of those lineages are in there. It's not to kind of, again, elevate one over the other, but to say, like, I think you can probably, for many readers, like the Malevich Black Square might come to your mind, whereas, maybe you haven't seen a really good image of a Maria Martinez black on black vessel. And so I'm trying to, if you flip through the book with the image program, have a kind of different genealogies that for me really is about a more expansive or extensive way to tell art histories in the plural. So I'm glad that both Trevor and Bridget, that you noticed that, and it's something that I felt really strongly about. The crazy making thing about a book as compared to, say, like a lecture in a class is that you really only have so many images, like in the contract, it says like, this is the number, and that it is excruciating. It is agonizing to decide, okay, well, I am not going to have, if I have a purifoy, that something else is not going to be there. So I did make decisions at the level of the image program. Okay, I'm going to have, this Brazilian female carver who's almost totally unknown in this country, Conceição Freitas da Silva, otherwise known as Conceição dos Bugres, who worked with wood and made figures that look, literally putting a face to wood. I want to have her, and that means that someone else isn't going to be there. And maybe that someone else who's not going to be there is Picasso, and that's okay. Like, I actually decided that was part of the ethics of me working on this project and investing a lot of resources, was that I wanted to amplify, and make visible someone like Conceição Freitas da Silva alongside Nevelson.
Well, I think it's extraordinary, and it breathes so much life, not only into the world, but also back into Nevelson. And so I think it was incredibly successful and exciting and rich, and just a very fresh way of seeing and feeling, kind of reading that. Maybe we could wrap up. I have a question for you, which is about, you've worked with Nevelson as an art historian, a chronicler, writing about Nevelson. You've always also worked with Nevelson's work as a curator. Mm-hmm. And I wondered, like, how did those inform each other? Was anything surprising or made you see the work differently? What is that relationship?
Yes, great question. Thank you. Well, I think that putting that show together, that was in Venice. It was a collateral event of the Venice Biennial last year, helped me appreciate in a different way, in a more intimate way, the importance of her collages and the importance of the kind of more small scale work, because that show included a lot of collages that had never been seen before. So, and I would never have, and had not been reproduced. So I think that the tactility and the actual just sheer exuberant experimentation that Nevelson had around materiality and form and recombining things, that was such a revelation for me. And actually, I think it was a revelation for the audiences who saw the show in Venice. Everyone, I mean, people just could not stop talking to me about the collages and how amazing they are, which I really do feel like they are. And I think they just looked so great in Venice, you know? So I think that there was something about being able to work with the material with this kind of under-recognized set of work that did help me round out my appreciation of all of her innovations. And I mean, sometimes, you know, the collages are really, some of them are very intricate and some of them are large scale, like in her Volcanic Magic series, where she's putting whole bed frames, you know, onto the wall, the really muscular, you know, incredibly Herculean efforts. But some of them, this is the back of the volume drag, are really simple. So this is just one little, like basically a shim, you know, like a tiny piece of wood that's a little, looks like it's got like licked by black spray paint. That's it, on a piece of black, on a black ground. So this really stripped down aesthetic that she also sometimes would snap into, where just highlighting one fragment, you know, from the world so that we can kind of appreciate it in a different way. And to me, thinking about not only assemblage and the found object, but also a more scaled back aesthetic that she sometimes did demonstrate, you know. So I think that the show helped bring those things into focus.
Well, I know we're about to go into the Q&A, but Bridget, I wanted to see, is there anything that you really wanted to comment on or talk about before we open it up?
Thanks, Trevor. You know, there was just one more point that I wanted to voice, which is another reason why this whole project is a model for new art histories. And what I find that you're able to do is to talk about a spectrum of different identities, some of which are yours, some of which are not. Which we're not very good at doing. You know, there is something to be said for being able to speak directly about your own people, your own community. There is authority there, there is privilege there that needs to be recognized and respected. There's also incredible power for someone else to speak with an informed perspective about an identity that's not their own. And we don't do enough of that. And so these different pushes for respect and dignity and freedom are often very siloed, that you speak for you, you speak for you. And there's a way in which it can be done very poorly. And I think people don't do it because they're afraid that they're going to say something wrong. If you believe in something and you're informed, guess what? You're probably not going to say something wrong. You're probably going to speak something truthful and powerful, and be a model for other people that say, well, that's what I feel too, but I never say it because I'm afraid. So there's a way in which the book serves as a model for how that can be done with confidence. The politics of citation of the book, I think, are right on. All of the people that you cite, particularly thinking about Blackness and all of its different layers. You know, you're citing people in a way that shows that you know that field, you have done the research, and that you can bring it into this conversation. I mean, it is really a model for other people to, I think, maybe feel brave enough to speak up and say, I also believe that, and I have a platform to say, you know, something that might encourage people to think outside of their own identities. So I really appreciate that. That was the other main thing I just wanted to say aloud in this in the forum.
Well, that was absolutely beautiful and really, really meaningful to me. So meaningful. Yeah. Thank you, Bridget.
My pleasure.
And I feel sure there are questions, but I don't know who's in charge of moderating that part.
Yeah, I can jump in here for the Q&A. Thank you so much, Julia and Bridget and Trevor, for this absolutely incredible conversation. I cannot wait to read the books. Thank you so much. We do have a bunch of questions from the audience. So the first question I'm going to read on behalf of Rachel. Rachel wrote, "Gleaning, scavenging, as well as joining/piecing are central to collage. I was struck that Louise Nevelson made collage just as Thaddeus Mosley, who spoke on Tuesday, made collage. What did the acts of making collage reference also assemblage, offer Nevelson, or to sculpture in general, considering the genre's very great differences in scale, weight, and even use of space?"
Great question. Maybe, I mean, I'd be happy to also hear from Trevor and Bridget if you have any thoughts about that. I guess one of the, if I'm right, the question is a little bit about like, what does collage give you, and how is collage maybe different or similar to assemblage? Maybe that's one of the, getting to the question, I guess. I mean, I think of collage as like the overarching rubric, perhaps. I don't really differentiate between like 2D collage versus 3D assemblage. To me, you're right, Rachel, that it is about piecing together or joining. And often it's about unlike parts being put into some kind of relationship. And to me, that, it's a hugely, it has motored so much artistic production, that kind of activity, the activity of putting disparate things together. And we can think of sort of like Eurocentric avant-garde lineages about that, but, I prefer to think about other, things like quilting or even cooking, actually, as a way of rethinking what a collage mentality might be, which is like that you are creating something new out of what's already existing by understanding that you can put things into somewhat different relationship. So, collage has been a kind of vaunted category of artistic creation in 19th and 20th century avant-garde histories. And I really also want to take it back to questions of women's work, the resourcefulness of the scavenger, or, as I said, the gleaner, someone who, because of a lack of resources, is turning to this more inventive way of creating things. Not sure if that was getting to your question, but it's a politics as well as a mode of making, I would say. And I do quote a new translation of Claude Lévi-Strauss's book, which in the new translation is called Wild Thought, where he talks about the bricoleur. And I don't necessarily go to that term bricoleur, but it is helpful to think of it as a kind of way of approaching the world. So I use Varda's term gleaner is a little bit more, or dragger. I mean, that's the term I really go to, the idea that someone is, dragging the streets, finding things of interest. I don't know if I answered that question.
I think so. Unless anyone else would like to jump in, I will read the next question, which is from Allison. Allison wrote, "Did you deliberately write the books in accessible language, or did you find that the accessible language came about naturally? Were you thinking of other models of art history books or other literary books while you were writing it? And this project sounds amazing," she said, "and I can't wait to read it."
Thank you, Allison. Well, I think that I just wrote it the way that I write, which is just happens to, or I don't know, not happens, but I have, since I began writing for an audience, I have always wanted to say things in a way that people would understand. I mean, that sounds like, who doesn't do that? Of course, like, who doesn't do that? We all are trying to write because we want to be understood, but believe it or not, that's not always the priority of everybody. And I have always really prioritized writing in things that, writing books that are clear. I hope that they are clear. And actually, I have been criticized, like sometimes ruthlessly critiqued for being overly descriptive or anthropological. Somehow I was just rereading a really negative critique of my first book, and those were the words that were used, too modest, too subtle, too not enough theory, too much description. And I kind of thought, well, that feels really gendered, that I'm too subtle, like I'm not doing these macho sweeping theories, like work is this, sculpture is that, like that's just not my style. It really just isn't. I want to be precise. I want to talk about things, that are happening within time and space and be really specific about it. So I guess I would say I wasn't, on the one hand, yes, I always aim to be clear. And on the other hand, it just is how I think maybe because my primary identity really is as a teacher, that's really how I see myself relating to the world, is through the fact that I'm a teacher, and I always do want just my students to understand. So I think it also flows from that identification. Mm-hmm. So it wasn't that I decided for this book, oh, you know what, I'm going to make this an accessible book. I think I always wrote that, and and hopefully it kind of comes through.
Amazing. Thank you so much for that great question. And thanks, Julia, for that answer. The next question I will read on behalf of Benjamin DeKosnik. Benjamin wrote, Julia, what a great and innovative book format. Any chance you could do one or two quote unquote reads of the volumes as a deck to demonstrate gameplay for the reader and narrate a journey with one volume, one image, to next volume and image, etc. Thank you for thinking about Louise Nevelson's work. I love Louise Nevelson's work.
Benjamin, I don't know exactly what gameplay is with the deck. I don't know. Maybe Trevor can help. Because I was
imagining a kind of situationist, reading one text and looking at the other images.
Oh, I see. Oh, right. Like a performance, like I see. The truth is I have my contact lenses in, and when I have, because I, for this presentation, which means that I am almost blind and I cannot actually read text. I have to have my glasses on to read. So no, Benjamin, I will do that for you because you're my friend and I'm actually going to see you tomorrow night for dinner. We will do that around the hot tub, I promise, but I cannot do that, unfortunately, for the audience here.
Well, I'm jealous, but that sounds amazing.
Something about the language that Benjamin used made me think of the witch and tarot.
Right. Yes.
And picking from the deck. And
it's true, the deck. Yeah. Right. Oh, I know what he's talking about because we do often do the tarot together. So just like pick something. Oh, well, actually, so Benjamin, I can see well enough to show you this spread here, which I'm very proud of, which is from the volume Face, where I'm thinking about how Nevelson's work faces the world. And I talk about not as a kind of fringe, happenstance, but as kind of core to her reception is how many children's projects, arts and crafts projects are made with Nevelson as an explicit reference, and how often arts and crafts projects in elementary schools, for example, will have students make, today you're going to make a Louise Nevelson, and they look at her art and then they maybe get a shoebox and they put wooden doodles inside and then they spray paint it a color. So here are things from her archive from the 70s of students making Nevelson projects, and then often the teachers would send photographs to Nevelson, and she apparently responded with a lot of enthusiasm about this. So to me, this is another way that I was hoping to kind of expand our histories, which is to say, this isn't just, it's important to see what people were saying about her in the New York Times. It was important that she got commissions or was in the Venice Biennial in 1962, et cetera. But it's also important that like students in, Connecticut are making projects with her as a reference, because that tells us something about the accessibility of her process itself. And it tells us something about how people understood her work as a kind of pedagogical toolkit. So thank you, Benjamin, for that's my reading. I've pulled something from the deck here, which is these children making a Nevelson project, and we can take that as like a good omen, I think.
That was incredible. Thank you so much, Benjamin, for bringing that to us. And thanks, Julia. Our next question, I will read on behalf of Maria Nevelson. Maria asks, how is Nevelson's interest in metaphysics covered in these books and her interest in the fourth dimension?
Right, great question. Thank you, Maria, for being on the call. It's not hugely addressed. I will say that the metaphysical angle, I'm much more interested in materiality and process, as I've said. But that's a great angle, I think, for for future books, and I hope there will be many. And perhaps some of the students who were part of these arts and crafts projects and were introduced to Nevelson in their classrooms will go on to write the book about Nevelson and metaphysics. I mean, she definitely was a spiritual seeker, that's for sure. And she was always thinking about what the ramifications might be of these new forms of architecture and, what Bridget just was calling dwelling. And those were kind of portals, to another dimension. So that's definitely, that's for sure.
Amazing answer. Thank you so much, Julia. And thanks, Maria, for the question. Our next question is going to be from our friend GE, and GE, I will let you unmute to ask.
Oh, thank you so very much, Eleanor. And thank you, panel, Julia and Bridget, and of course, Trevor. I had a multi-year encounter with Nevelson's Atmosphere and Environment number 5. It's located in the Empire State Plaza at Albany. And I used to visit all the time. And it kept inviting me back to walk around it, allowing see each box of it within its aluminum frame to kind of create multiple combinations and compositions. And I often wondered if I could say with any kind of accuracy that her art worked with a kind of parabolic language, kind of special openness to the universal, to look for a way of beauty, a way capable of elevating both the mind and the heart. And is there anything to this that's true? And thank you. I'd open it up to anybody that wants to talk about it. Thank you.
What a beautiful reflection. What an absolutely beautiful reflection. And I think that what I take from your comments, which strike me as perfectly apt, is the way that a lot of Nevelson's public work was about putting a frame around a vista, and that by doing that, by putting a frame around, or creating a peephole into an otherwise ordinary landscape, it does make it special. It does, you are getting a different aesthetic experience when you see things in that way. So I think what you said sounds absolutely right.
Thank you. Where it sits, that actually you can look through it and overlook the Hudson Valley and the Hudson River beyond, as you may well know. Yeah.
Yes, I do. Yes, and I think that the idea of kind of the interpenetration of the foreground and the background, I think that that's a lot of what she was playing with in those pieces. So thank you so much for those thoughts.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, GE. That was a really lovely reflection and question to end our Q&A. Unfortunately, I'm sorry if we didn't get to your questions. There were so many good ones, but we are now very excited to turn it over to Hannah for a poetry reading. And thanks again, Julia, for addressing all those great questions.
Thank you all. Thank you to everyone who asked a question. Thank you to Trevor, and Bridget, and thank you to Eleanor in the rail and Hannah.
And thank you for such an amazing contribution to culture, Julia. Congratulations on the book coming out. It's absolutely gorgeous. And I'm just thrilled that it exists and thrilled that you exist. And I hope everybody go out, buy the book, 5-star reviews, etc.
Oh, I forgot a really important thing, which is that there is a coupon code. You can get 25% off plus free shipping if you go to the Yale University Press site and you use the code Nevelson23. And that's really important. I want everyone to know that. Please buy the book. Maria, your copy is in the mail, but everyone else, please do. It would be, Nevelson23 from Yale University Press, 25% off and free shipping.
Awesome.
Amazing. Thank you so much for those shout outs. And yeah, definitely everybody get the book. I'm now so excited to introduce our poet laureate of the day, Hannah Treasure. Hannah Treasure is a lecturer in the English department at Clemson University. She received her MFA in poetry from Brooklyn College in 2020. Her work appears in Ghost City Review, Afternoon Visitor, No Dear, Volume Poetry, among others. Thank you so much, Hannah, for being here and reading today, and I'm thrilled to pass the mic over to you.
Hey everyone, thank you so much to the Brooklyn Rail. Thank you, Julia and Bridget and Trevor. That was such an awesome discussion. And yeah, just such an honor to be a part of this event. I'm going to start with one poem that was published in the Rail in the most recent issue about the wonderful, cute owl Flacco, who is still living freely in Central Park. It's called Flight Response. The guard at the Central Park Zoo dozes off to his daughter's voicemail, dreams of a simple open window. He can't shake the feeling silk curtains once adorned the portal, like they've just slipped out. The Eurasian eagle owl finds the mesh of his enclosure slashed by the moon and flies to the nearest pine. In Gertrude Abercrombie's Strange Shadows, an owl appears where her cocktail once was. Her arm, curved as a hammock, branches toward the animal. I'm not rooting for anyone, the patrons say, especially not the woman's arm. I just cheer when my attention is captured. When park tourists pose for group photos, instead of cheese, they now say the owl's name, Flacco. The child holds out vowels, Flacco, until the bird closes his eyes in contentment. Flacco doesn't know about rat poison or windows, the weight it takes to slip away. Flacco won't eat his rat while you're watching, that's private. Bird watchers are told their mere presence in the habitat is a disturbance. You must stick to the marked trail, even if you've seen someone set themselves free. All right, then I thought I would read a couple from this new series that I'm working on about online purchasing reviews, online shopping reviews. I think they're an amazing form and such a weird little combination of people speaking with such an authority, but also they end up being kind of vulnerable because people just can't help put these kind of personal aspects into this little tiny prompt. So yeah, a couple of those. This one is called Citronella Candle, 5 stars. What other miracle costs $7? These faint rings appear when you light it. I had a glass of wine on the patio for the first time in 5 years. My daughter used to sit out here with me, and once she left, all I could think about were the bugs. When she was a kid, we'd sleep out here some summer nights. We'd wake to pouring rain on our cheeks, and I'd make a beeline for the house, but she'd move tenderly, ghostly across the wood, as if protected by something. This one is Melatonin Gummies, 4 stars. These work. I take one every night instead of getting stoned. The taste is fake strawberry, in a good way, like a snow cone. I feel rested when I wake up and I remember my dreams. I only took 1 star off because in the last dream, my husband found out he had gotten another woman pregnant a long time ago, and it was very painful for me to see the new little boy as his carelessness. There wasn't a way to express my anger that he hadn't prioritized our future before we'd met. I just kept feeding the kid cereal, wondering how I'd know when he was full. All right. The last one. Waterproof liquid eyeliner, 5 stars. Do you know what you're doing with this in your cart? Does anyone know what permanence is until they have it? I will give birth in this eyeliner. I will dive into the dark closets of my lover's arms in this eyeliner. I will lie to the cops in this eyeliner. I will sweat bullets. And when I die, you'll see the wings of my eyes laid on a pillow, same as ever, and refuse to believe I went anywhere. Thank you so much.
Well, awesome, Hannah.
Oh my gosh, Hannah, that was so beautiful.
Thank
I
you.
love that series. That was amazing. Thank you so
Appreciate it.
much.
I hope that it
Um,
was appropriate to tie in with the, the objectness of Nevelson's work. But yeah, thank you
Absolutely.
for letting me be a part.
Yeah, thank you so much for being here and for reading. And of course, just a huge thank you again to Julia and Bridget and Trevor. Congratulations, Julia, on the incredible books. And we would also like to thank the Terra Foundation for American Art for sponsoring our NSE program and making these daily conversations possible. And they also support our growing YouTube archive, which you can check out on our YouTube channel. And this conversation will be posted there very soon. For the past 22 years, the Brooklyn Rail has provided a platform for the arts, culture, and politics through our monthly publication and public events like our daily NSEs. Please check the chat for a link to donate to support our work here at the Rail. And join us tomorrow at 1 p.m. for a conversation with Pedro Reyes and Jose Falcone on the event of Reyes' solo exhibition at Listen Gallery Los Angeles. And we'll conclude with a reading by Pierre Joris. Thanks all for tuning in today, and you can now all turn on your microphones and say hello and goodbye as you leave. Thank you. It's so great to see you all, and I hope you have a great rest of your day.
Congratulations.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank
you.
Congratulations.
Don't forget to
Thank you,
order the book
Trevor.
with the coupon code.
Don't
Yeah,
forget the
thank you,
Paulo.
Bridget.
Thank you, Hannah, for your reading.
Congratulations. Thank you so much, you guys.